She was 31 years old, and she had exactly $5 and a dead husband's army discharge papers when the Territorial Bank of Canaan's Reach, Arizona, called the note on the livery stable she had operated alone for 2 years, in the dry summer of 1894. 3 months after a fever took her husband Jonas in 11 days and left her the sole manager of a business that the bank had apparently been patient with only as a courtesy to a veteran's name and not to a widow's competence. The bank's agent, a precise and entirely unmoved man named Fletcher Crow who delivered the foreclosure with the specific efficiency of someone who has calculated that sentiment costs more than it returns, informed Elsa Vane that the outstanding balance on the livery's operating loan exceeded what the property would sell for in the current market, that the discrepancy would be absorbed by the institution as a cost of doing business in difficult territory, and that she had 14 days to vacate. A building she had spent 2 years repairing, expanding, and running at a quality that every rider in Canaan's Reach privately acknowledged as the best horsework in the county. $5. Discharge papers she could not spend. And a notice, tacked to the Territorial Land Office's public board that same afternoon, that the Army was auctioning a decommissioned supply wagon and its contents, a Studebaker freight wagon last registered to the 3rd Cavalry's 1872 resupply convoy, which had departed Fort Calder that October and never arrived, the Army having written off the wagon, its team, and its cargo as lost in the desert crossing and since recovered, teamless and driverless, in a canyon wash that the Territorial Survey had only recently mapped, at a minimum bid of $3, sold as found, contents unexamined and unspecified. Elsa Vane paid $3 of her $5 for it on a Tuesday morning while Fletcher Crow's bank finished processing her eviction paperwork 2 doors down the street, and every person who witnessed the transaction agreed it was the most foolish thing a woman in her circumstances could possibly have done. What was sealed in the freight boxes of that 22-year-old Army wagon had not been opened since the day it left Fort Calder, and what it contained, once Elsa finally worked the lock free in the canyon heat, would not only restore her life entirely, but would finally answer for a wrong that had been costing the families of Canaan's Reach something they had never been able to name, because they had never known what had actually been taken from them. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Elsa Vane. If you have ever been the one person willing to look at something everyone else had already walked past and decided was finished, tell us in the comments, because this story is for you, and it has been waiting a long time to be told. Elsa had grown up understanding horses in the specific, unglamorous, and entirely practical way of someone for whom horses were not a romance but a working relationship requiring daily negotiation, careful attention, and a willingness to be honest about what the animal in front of you actually needed rather than what you preferred it to need. Her father, Hector Vane, had run a small freight operation in the Sonoran country for the better part of her childhood, 3 wagons and 8 horses and a territory reputation built on the particular trustworthiness of a man who always delivered what he said he would deliver and never promised what the country between here and there might make impossible. He taught Elsa the horses before he taught her the freight, walking her through the morning check of every animal in the string before she was old enough to reach a full-grown horse's shoulder without a box to stand on, teaching her to read condition in the animal's coat and eye and the way it distributed its weight, to understand that a horse's soundness on a given morning was the entire foundation of whether a day's work would go well or badly and that no amount of harness quality or wagon maintenance or route knowledge substituted for the animal's own willingness and capacity to do what was being asked of it. He did not teach her this as formal instruction. He taught her by doing it himself, every morning, and by simply expecting her to be there beside him while he did it, which she was, from the time she was 4 years old until she was old enough to do the check herself while he moved on to the wagons. Her mother, Constance, had died when Elsa was 9, of the kind of swift and merciless fever that the desert country produced with a regularity that its residents were never quite able to entirely accept as normal, though they lived alongside the possibility with the resigned practicality of people who understood that the desert offered its particular beauties and its particular costs and that negotiating with either was not a productive use of a person's limited energy. Constance had been a meticulous woman, a former schoolteacher from Ohio whose particular gift had been the ability to make complicated things clear without making them simple, a quality that expressed itself in her household management as an insistence on records, on the written account of what had actually happened rather than the remembered version, which she had always maintained was the less reliable of the two. She had instilled in Elsa, before her death, a habit of writing things down at the moment of their occurrence that Elsa carried into adulthood with the same automatic quality as breathing, and which would matter, across the weeks ahead, considerably more than she could have anticipated when she reached into her satchel for her field journal on a hot Arizona afternoon in a canyon she had never expected to be standing in. Hector had kept the freight operation running through Elsa's adolescence and into her early 20s, and she had worked alongside him through all of it, learning the routes and the weather patterns and the water sources and the particular psychology of every pass and canyon crossing between Canaan's Reach and the 6 settlements it served, accumulating across those years a working knowledge of the desert country's geography that exceeded what most men twice her age who had traveled the same territory possessed, partly because she had paid attention and partly because her father had, without making any particular statement about it, simply treated her knowledge as worth acquiring and her questions as worth answering. When Hector's own health began failing in the year she turned 23, a slow deterioration of the joints that made the physical demands of the freight work increasingly difficult, Elsa had taken over the daily management of the operation without ceremony or announcement, simply doing what needed doing because she was the person present who knew how to do it. Hector died 2 years later, peacefully and at home, and Elsa had buried him with the same practical attention she brought to everything and had then looked at what remained of the freight operation and made the calculation that a wagon livery in Canaan's Reach offered more sustainable prospects than an aging freight string operated by a woman alone, and had made the transition with the unsentimental efficiency that was her most consistent characteristic. Jonas Vane, who had been a farrier before the army took him and a cavalryman before an honorable discharge returned him to civilian life, had arrived in Canaan's Reach the year Elsa opened the livery, initially as a customer for his own horse's regular shoeing and subsequently as a business partner whose horsework skills complemented her facility management in a way that made the livery genuinely excellent rather than merely adequate. They had married in the 2nd year, a practical arrangement that suited both of them and had grown, in the way of practical arrangements between compatible people, into something considerably warmer than its origin suggested. Jonas had been a good man, straightforward and capable and honest in the specific way of soldiers who have been in difficult situations and have decided, as a result, that honesty requires less energy to maintain than its alternative. His death had been swift and savage and entirely unfair, and Elsa had not wasted time being angry about it because anger at a fever was as productive as anger at the desert itself, which was to say it was something you were entitled to feel but not something you could afford to be consumed by if you intended to continue functioning. The fall, when it came, had the particular quality of falls that arrive not because you have done anything wrong but because the structures you have been trusting to hold were already compromised before you began to depend on them, a discovery that is uniquely difficult to absorb because it offers no corrective lesson beyond the general wisdom of not trusting structures whose foundations you cannot inspect. The bank's operating loan had been Jonas's arrangement, made in the first year of the livery when a cash injection was necessary for the expansion that eventually made the business viable, and the terms he had negotiated were reasonable for a veteran with a credible track record and a developing business in a growing territorial town. What Jonas had not known, and what Fletcher Crowe explained to Elsa with the careful neutrality of a man conveying facts rather than rendering a judgment, was that the note's fine print included a personal guarantee clause that made Jonas's death a triggering event for early repayment, a clause whose practical effect on a widow operating alone on the livery's existing revenue was exactly what it appeared to be, which was that the loan was immediately unserviceable and the business was therefore immediately forfeit regardless of its current quality or its prospective value or anything else that a reasonable person might consider relevant to the question of whether foreclosure served anyone's actual interests. It did not serve Elsa's interests, but the note did not require that, and Fletcher Crowe was not in the business of interests, he was in the business of notes, and the note was clear. She spent her 14 days of notice doing 3 things simultaneously, finishing every outstanding horse commission the livery held, because she had given her word on those commissions and intended to keep it regardless of what the bank was doing to her property, making careful written records of every piece of equipment and every improvement she had personally funded since the livery's opening, against the remote possibility that a legal distinction between her personal investment and the bank's collateral might eventually matter to someone with authority to act on it, and paying, on the notice's 11th day, $3 at the county land office for an army wagon that had been sitting in a canyon wash for 22 years and that the territorial survey team had only recently located and reported because their route through the canyon had been necessitated by a new mapping project rather than any specific interest in the wagon's existence. She drove out to the canyon the morning after the purchase, borrowing a horse from a neighbor who knew her well enough to lend without asking what she intended to do with the territory's most conspicuously purposeless piece of abandoned military equipment. The canyon was a 2-hour ride from Canaan's Reach, a deep red-walled cut in the desert floor that ran roughly east to west and that Elsa had ridden past a dozen times over the years without ever having a reason to descend into it, its walls steep enough that the interior was in shadow by mid-afternoon and cool enough even in summer to make it, once she reached the floor, a distinctly different climate than the desert above. The wagon was exactly where the survey team's report had placed it, lodged against the canyon's north wall in a natural alcove where the wall curved inward, its position suggesting that it had been driven there deliberately rather than simply abandoned in mid-crossing, its wooden sides weathered to silver gray but structurally intact in the way of quality Studebaker construction, which was built to outlast most of the circumstances that overtook the people who drove it. The team was long gone, obviously, and the harness was gone with it, but the wagon's freight boxes, 3 large crates secured under the wagon's canvas cover, itself still partially intact where the alcove's overhang had shielded it from the direct desert sun, were still latched, and the latches were the Army's standard iron pattern, still functional beneath their surface rust, secured by a padlock on each crate whose keyhole told her, when she examined it with the same focused attention she brought to any mechanical problem, that the lock was a simple pin tumbler of the kind that a bent wire and 10 minutes of patient manipulation would generally address. She had the first crate open before noon, working the lock free with a piece of wire from her saddlebag, and what she found inside was not what she had expected, because she had not formed a strong expectation, having bought the wagon on the basis of a general principle rather than any specific theory about its contents. The first crate held medical supplies, or had held them, most of the actual medicines long since dried or evaporated past usefulness, but the organization of the crate told her something immediately, which was that these supplies had been packed with military precision by someone who understood that the contents represented a specific and intentional cargo rather than general provisioning, each item type wrapped separately and labeled in a hand she could identify as official from the quality of the labeling even before she found, tucked under the crate's interior ledge at the far end, a sealed leather document wallet of the kind used by the Army for orders and official correspondence, its flap secured with a wax seal that had been pressed with a Fort Calder stamp and which was, 22 years after its pressing, still entirely intact. She sat down on the canyon floor beside the wagon with the wallet in her hands and the afternoon shadow beginning to cool the red walls around her, and she opened the seal with the same deliberate attention she brought to any document she was about to read carefully, understanding that what a person found in a sealed military document wallet was not always comfortable but was almost always consequential, and that comfortable and consequential were different qualities that did not always arrive together. What would you expect to find sealed in the official correspondence of a military supply convoy that departed a frontier fort in 1872 and never arrived at its destination? Whatever answer your imagination offers, we can tell you that what Elsa found in that wallet in the canyon shadow was not treasure in any ordinary sense, and not a mystery in any fictional sense, but something considerably more specific and considerably more consequential for the people of Canaan's Reach, who had been living, without knowing it, in the long shadow of what that wallet contained for 22 years. The wallet held 6 documents. 3 were standard Army supply manifests for the convoy's cargo, confirming what the 3 crates contained, medical supplies for the territorial settlements along the Fort Calder route, military payroll for the fort's own garrison in a strongbox she had not yet examined, and here Elsa read the 3rd manifest twice before trusting her understanding of it, a complete set of original land grant certificates for the 5 homestead families who had been waiting, by the document's date, for nearly a year for the Territorial Land Office to process their applications, certificates that had been formally issued by the Territorial Governor's Office and were being transported by military escort at the Governor's personal request because the families involved had been waiting long enough that political embarrassment was becoming a factor. The other 3 documents were more personal and more damning. The first was a letter from Fort Calder's commanding officer to the Territorial Adjutant General, dated 3 days before the convoy's departure, describing a conversation he had had with a Canaan's Reach land speculator named Archibald Soon, who had expressed, in terms the commanding officer found both inappropriate and memorable, the view that the 5 homestead certificates would, if delivered, prevent his own purchase of the same acreage at considerably more favorable terms than the homestead families had received from the territory, and that he would consider it a professional favor if the convoy experienced a delay of sufficient duration for the territorial land market to reorder itself around his interests. The second document was a response from the Adjutant General noting only that the commanding officer's concern had been received and would be considered, a response whose brevity was itself a kind of answer. The third was a route alteration order, signed by a captain whose name Elsa did not recognize, redirecting the convoy through a canyon route that the standard army maps of 1872 showed as passable but that any person with genuine knowledge of the desert country would have known was not passable for a loaded freight wagon in October, which was the month the canyon's flash flood season began. The 5 homestead families, Elsa understood with a slowness that was not stupidity but the specific reluctance of a person absorbing an implication whose full weight arrives in stages rather than all at once, had never received their certificates. The convoy had been deliberately routed into a canyon crossing in flash flood season, which was to say it had been sent there expecting not to arrive, and the certificates had sat in a canyon wash for 22 years while the 5 families who had waited for them had eventually, each in their own particular way, given up waiting and moved on or sold out or simply accepted that the territorial land office was slow and the territory was difficult and that some things did not arrive. The land those certificates would have granted was currently, she was reasonably certain without yet having checked, in the possession of a land-holding company whose origins in Canaan's reach she could trace, without difficulty, to a man named Archibald Soon who had died 11 years prior and whose grandson, Clement Soon, currently held the largest private land portfolio in the county, sat on the Territorial Bank's Regional Advisory Board, and had been, among the first people Fletcher Crow had contacted when the question of Elsa's livery loan came due, as a potential buyer for the property. She sat in the canyon alcove until the shadow reached the canyon floor entirely and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes the way desert canyons do, holding those 6 documents and thinking with the focused, methodical clarity of someone who has been doing practical problem solving long enough to know that the quality of the solution depends entirely on the quality of the thinking that precedes it. She was not angry, or not primarily, because anger was an expenditure that the situation did not yet justify. She was calculating, which was what her father had always called it when she was a girl, and he was describing a quality he considered her best one, the ability to assess a complex situation without flinching from what it actually contained and then determine, from what it contained, what the most productive response was. The most productive response, she concluded, was not to confront Clement Soon, who would deny, deflect, and deploy the bank's considerable institutional weight against her before she could establish the documentary record she needed. The most productive response was the same response her mother would have recommended and her father would have approved, which was to write everything down immediately, in her own hand, with the documents beside her as she wrote, and then to ensure that the written account reached someone with authority to act on it before Clement soon understood that a canyon wash he had never thought about since his grandfather's time had just been excavated by a woman with $5 and nothing left to lose. She returned to Canaan's Reach the following morning and went directly to the office of the county's territorial justice of the peace, a woman named Ruth Allard who had held the position for 6 years and whose reputation for impartiality was well established enough that even people who had lost cases before her spoke of her with a certain grudging respect. Elsa presented the documents, her own written account of their discovery, and a brief summary of what she believed the documents demonstrated, and then she sat quietly while Ruth Allard read every page of every document with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at and intended to understand it correctly before she said a single word about it. What followed was neither swift nor simple, because the law's relationship to a wrong committed 22 years prior through the deliberate destruction of a military convoy was complicated by time and jurisdiction and the death of the principal parties, and because Clement Soon's attorneys were capable and well-resourced and contested every finding with the thoroughness that substantial land holdings require of their defense. But Ruth Allard had sent copies of the documents to the territorial governor's office within 24 hours of Elsa's visit, and the territorial governor, who had political reasons of his own to be interested in a story about one of his predecessors' land grant certificates being deliberately destroyed, had moved with a speed that suggested his interest was genuine rather than merely institutional. Clement Soon was informed of the investigation 2 weeks after Elsa's canyon visit, which was 2 weeks too late to do anything about the documentary record that Ruth Allard had already placed in multiple independent hands. The investigation took 8 months, and its outcome was not a simple restoration of the original homestead grants, since the land itself had passed through multiple hands in the intervening decades and the law's capacity to unwind 22 years of title chain was limited by both statute and practical equity. But it produced a negotiated settlement that required the Soon Land Holding Company to fund a territorial compensation trust for the descendants of the 5 original homestead families, calculated against the assessed value of the land they had never received and the 2 decades of productive use they had been denied, a sum that proved, when properly calculated with the territorial assessor's assistance, to be considerably larger than Clement Soon's attorneys had initially suggested it would need to be. It also produced, through a separate proceeding that Ruth Allard initiated on her own authority, a review of the territorial bank's foreclosure practices in cases where the bank's regional advisory board had a material interest in the foreclosed property, a review that found, in the case of Elsa's livery, sufficient irregularity in the timing and terms of the call notice to require the bank to offer a renegotiated loan on terms that reflected the property's actual value rather than the terms of the original note. Elsa accepted the renegotiated loan and reopened the livery within the month, and the first commission she took when she reopened was a horse that Clement soon sent for shoeing, an act of apparent normalcy that she performed with the same quality she brought to everything and charged for at her standard rate, because the territory needed horsework done honestly and she was the best person in Canaan's reach to do it, and nothing that had happened in the preceding 8 months changed either of those facts. We come back, at the end of every story, to the moment of beginning, because the beginning contains the ending in compressed form, the whole of what a thing means visible in miniature before the full scale of events has had a chance to unfold it. Elsa Vane had stood at a county land office window with $5 and paid 3 of them for an army wagon that had been sitting in a desert canyon for 22 years because she was the person present who recognized that an object with an unknown inside is not the same thing as an object with an empty inside, a distinction that sounds obvious when stated plainly and that a remarkable number of people fail to apply in practice. She had applied it because her father had taught her that the animal in front of you is telling you something if you are patient and attentive enough to receive it, and her mother had taught her that the thing received is only as good as the written account that preserves it, and Jonas had taught her, by example rather than instruction, that the honest execution of a skill is the most durable form of argument available to a person who lacks access to the other kinds. She had not known, paying $3 for a weather-silvered Studebaker wagon, that she was purchasing the specific container that held a 22-year-old wrong waiting for the right pair of hands to bring it out of the canyon. She had known only that a sealed thing is not a finished thing, and that patience applied to a sealed thing generally produces an answer worth having, and that the desert, like most difficult country, rewards the person who reads it carefully over the person who reads it quickly, and that she was, in all these respects, exactly the kind of person her circumstances had produced her to be. Elsa Vane, who had once stood in Canaan's reach with $5 and an eviction notice and a wagon full of 22-year-old army secrets that nobody had thought to ask about since the century was younger, became within 2 years the most trusted livery operator in the territory, not because fortune had decided to favor her but because she had refused to let a foreclosure notice, a banker's arithmetic, or a canyon's 22 years of patient silence keep her from opening what everyone else had already decided was not worth the trouble of unlocking. She kept the original Fort Calder document wallet on the wall of the reopened livery, behind the farrier's workbench where Jonas had done his best work, not as a monument to the wrong that had been done but as an accurate description of the instrument that had finally made the right response possible, which was the same instrument her mother had always recommended and her father had always practiced and her own best work had always expressed, the simple, patient, written account of what was actually there. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight, and with Elsa, and with the wagon that waited 22 years in a desert canyon for someone to bring it back into the light. If this story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to be reminded that the things the world has sealed away and left in the canyon are not always empty, and that patience and a wire pick are sometimes everything you need. And we would love to know, what is a time in your own life when you opened something that everyone else had given up on, and found that it was still holding exactly what it had always been meant to hold? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one, and we are grateful every time. Until next time, stay close.